Bangsamoro Transitional Government will be appointed for a year in 2015, but will need to run for elections in 2016. The motion is, this House will extend the appointment of the Bangsamoro Transition Government until 2019. Let's call on the Prime Minister.
We think that under the model of the representation, even in the context of Bangsamoro, we don't see the reason why allowing an election to further be rushed in 2016 is something considered as strategic. We think that as long as we cater the problem of marginalized representation, which has been the battle cry of ARMM in the past, we are perfectly fine with that, no matter what mode it is, whether it's appointment or etc. It's the reason why we are going to clash the concept of where is democracy limited, especially when you're still going into a correct transition. That's because we think that this is a vital year for Bangsamoro. For example, you have constitutional breakdowns, for example, or different sets of authoritarian clashes, for example, and it cannot be afforded that you just rush into an election without solving this in a mere time. It's the reason why you even have different types of monitoring bodies, for example, or you even have the central government to appoint certain officials that are sensitive to the needs and the calibrations needed to improve ARMM when they transition into a Bangsamoro government. But along the line, we see that this is going to be the main contention of the opposing side, that there is a necessity to institutionalize people to select their representatives to represent them, to be sensitive to their needs, or to have public policies, for example, solved under the entire model. First, we do not see that there is that type of problem under the model is not going to be answered. By virtue of appointment, the appointed official once he is capable or efficient enough to carry out such types of responsibility, or he can carry out those types of social services. But under the model, we will even explain in the first argument where appointment becomes better when the symbol of authority, for example, could not be there from the people, and we will explain further what's the difference between an appointment and election the moment you transition in the Bangsamoro period, and why is it better. In the first case, the concept of transition means we need try to first reparate ARMM as of the moment. We do think that at the end of the day, the moment we rush into the concept of reparating ARMM is to change the political character within. We think that the moment we appoint someone, there is still a responsibility being fixed on them. At least, under our model, they are independent from the people. If we try to look at what is happening by ARMM in the past, only dominant political parties wins, or the regional governor comes from the most political dominant party. Under the model of them, they're still catering the oppressive majority. But under the model of appointment, we are being fair on the ground. We see to it that every section of society are being penetrated, and by that, every appointment is crucial to the every needs of the region. At the end of the day, we can even better have a regional integration rather than rushing into an election wherein you will only have a one political character that comes from one region, for example. At least, at the end of the day, under our model that there is already a political seat, we will not be accountable to the electorates. What does this mean? Which means that, for example, if your Bangsamoro Chief Minister, for example, comes from Basilan, he will only be accountable to the people within Basilan, then because these are the people who voted for him. This is quite harmful. Why? That's because you allow societal pressures to influence the policy making and even the legislative capabilities of this type of Chief Ministers. Your point.
Exactly the reason why we have to want an election, because it's the right time we tell the people that the Bangsamoro government is different from ARMM.
We don't see the reason that Bangsamoro, sure, Bangsamoro is different from ARMM, but let's characterize. Is democracy really the problem of ARMM? No, it's not. It's the over-oppressive of the majority, and that. We don't think that ARMM is not democratized, and so is Bangsamoro. I will also discuss in my second argument later that Bangsamoro is still democratized even in these systems. Going on, the ability to perform even the different devolved powers can only happen by matters of appointment. What does this mean? This means that there are even selective powers or exclusive powers that these types of appointees needs to practice, which means that the moment you rush them into an election, you create an imperative for them to make these powers, for example, absent that they need to function. At least in the concept of appointment, you better fix the responsibility of this type of people. Under the election, it is not. It's only sensitive to different sectors, to selected sectors of society, which means there is not even a correct equality under the entire model, which is the goal of Bangsamoro to begin with. In an election, for example, you are subjected, of course, to popular support. But if you try to look at it at the span of one year, we don't think that the popular support, or you can even forward a proper social platforms at that point of time, which means that running the appointment for almost 4 years becomes a better environment where people are already aware of what are the problems on the ground, which means that they can even have a better decision making and are not immature in selecting their officials, because under the model it's all the concept of popular will and place representation, something that they have lacked. Without that, I wonder how we maintain the autonomy of the different officials to the people is something we considered as vital. We don't think that at the end of the day, they would not be heard. It's the reason why I will stand to my second argument, or why social cohesion, for example, or why Bangsamoro is still democratized. If you try to look at the ministerial form of government, you elect by political party systems, and these political party systems reach out to your people out there in terms of, I don't know, asking for different types of social platforms, which means that assuming that we have already created a mean by them that they can still be represented, what's the point of choosing someone out there? As long as their different battle cards can still be heard or can still be calibrated, we are perfectly fine. The ability to penetrate every social system, an ability of the government to be independent and to create a more holistic approach rather than a selective one in the concept of reparating Bangsamoro, for example, and making it a better government will only happen through appointment. They have to explain why Bangsamoro is better with election. For all those reasons, we are proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. To provide a clash, let's call on Leader of Opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, long-standing problems of injustice, poverty, social, political marginalization caused by laws and policies that are not tuned to be the grievances, identities, and experiences of the Bangsamoro, ladies and gentlemen. The question in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, what is the most effective way on how we can attain effective Bangsamoro at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen? Bangsamoro political entity, ladies and gentlemen, is something a new beginning, a new age, ladies and gentlemen. It is the voice of the people, ladies and gentlemen. The opening oppositions came into this debate. We will prove to you why the value of election is something valuable in this for Bangsamoro transitional government, ladies and gentlemen. Election is the cornerstone of the Bangsamoro political entity, ladies and gentlemen. Sit down. Why did we say that this is the cornerstone of the Bangsamoro political entity, ladies and gentlemen? But before going to that, few points of responses, ladies and gentlemen. According to the Prime Minister, that when you appoint, it is the most effective way, ladies and gentlemen. We think when you appoint, there is a qualification, ladies and gentlemen, that is not conformed with the people, ladies and gentlemen. It is conformed with the government, ladies and gentlemen, and that is a theoretical concept, ladies and gentlemen. Let's take a look on today's status quo, ladies and gentlemen. The psychological perspective of the people, ladies and gentlemen. The people nowadays, ladies and gentlemen, want something tangible, ladies and gentlemen, because these people are not equal, are not the same with the government, ladies and gentlemen, because these people would like to see actual progression, ladies and gentlemen, and how we are going to do it, ladies and gentlemen. Election is something, it is a way of distinguishing a factor to whether or not the Bangsamoro transitional government is functionable or not. Sure.
The four-year allowance is the reason why marginalized sections of society are going to be catered. The moment you rush into the election, you ensure that this 4 year will answer the majority, which means you still continue the problem with the marginalized sections of AMN the moment you transited into a Bangsamoro.
We believe, ladies and gentlemen, yes, we believe that 1 year timeline, ladies and gentlemen, is premature, ladies and gentlemen. But at some point, we can still attain progression, ladies and gentlemen. We believe we cannot acquire everything, ladies and gentlemen. Like, for example, taxation, ladies and gentlemen. We cannot see LGU within 1 year, ladies and gentlemen. But we can see that later on, that we can see there will be this Bangsamoro transitional government can render basic services to the people, ladies and gentlemen. What are these basic services, ladies and gentlemen? For example, healthcare, ladies and gentlemen. Education to the people, ladies and gentlemen. Because it is one of the factor to distinguish ladies and gentlemen. How and why, ladies and gentlemen? At least, ladies and gentlemen, at that 1 year timeline, ladies and gentlemen, we can correct the system if there is problem, ladies and gentlemen. Unlike on the government side, it will take so long, ladies and gentlemen, for the people, because these people have already struggled for the long period of time. Second, election is the voice of grassroots of Bangsamoro, ladies and gentlemen. When we follow election, ladies and gentlemen, in Bangsamoro transitional government, it is one way of realization if this Bangsamoro transitional government is effective. Because now, in the present time, ladies and gentlemen, it is only theoretical, ladies and gentlemen. It is only in the paper that yes, we believe Bangsamoro is functionable, ladies and gentlemen. But we cannot. But if we will wait for the long period of time, we cannot really test the real essence of Bangsamoro, ladies and gentlemen. At least in a short period of time, we can correct if the system is flawed, ladies and gentlemen. At least as early as possible, through election, we can already identify what are the lapses of both sides, ladies and gentlemen, of the government, ladies and gentlemen, and the concept of the Bangsamoro, ladies and gentlemen. The opening opposition believes that we must conform with the present problem in the status quo, ladies and gentlemen. The psychological perspective of the people, ladies and gentlemen. They want to see tangible effect, ladies and gentlemen. They want to see immediately a change, ladies and gentlemen. We can see it may not be a total change, ladies and gentlemen, but it will be a way for initial change, ladies and gentlemen. At some point, these people can see basic services services, ladies and gentlemen. At some point, for the long period of time, at least these people can see a little of progression, ladies and gentlemen. But at the end of the day, we can still achieve long-term effectiveness, ladies and gentlemen, that my DLO will discuss later on. With all those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Extending the case of the government, let's call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello. Mr. Chair, we're not against the value of democracy. We're not against the value of elections. We realize that elections can be the voice of the grassroots. Essentially, that's the reason why we will have elections by 2019, right? Because we don't realize that we're not going to have elections at all. We're not going to have appointments ever. The point is, we have to nuance this debate specifically to a transitioning region, specifically to a region who is trying to adapt to certain changes, who is trying to adapt to structural reforms, which is still prone to trial and errors, for example, especially when the establishment of a ministerial form of government is totally new to the people. That's why all the benefits that they presented will still occur in our model, but the question is, what is the best political atmosphere in your initial years once we try to be able to establish the Bangsamoro? That's why when Leader of Opposition conceded that 1 year is a premature period of time, then we think that the 4 years allowance of period where you try to reparate the marginalized individuals will have a more effective way of trying to get away from those abuses that these people are trying to get away from. That's why, if we talk about the value of having appointment and not having qualifications, we don't think that's right. Let's proceed with my rebuttals. First is the idea about the qualifications in the appointment are not in conformity with the people. Number one, this is very weird. Because if you look at it, if you have qualifications, it is to guarantee that the people in governance will be able to do their job properly. And obviously, the people who will receive the good job of these people are also the individuals who will be affected with social services. So obviously, the qualifications are always in the judgment of which is best for the Bangsamoro people or for the individuals who will receive the benefits of those who are appointed. But secondly, they said that social services are important. But if you look at it, that's also conceivable. They need to prove why all the social services that they want will never accrue in our model. Especially when we talk about the people who are appointed, they are not vulnerable to any kind of specifications. They are not vulnerable to trying to address or only favor certain groups of people. Because when you are appointed, you are balanced. You are able to address the majority or you are able to address every single pocket of society. But when you automatically rush to elections, sit down, then the people who have elected, or then the people who have tried to have political parties being elected will be able to only sensitive to the people who actually elected them into power. So for example, if the representative from the feminist movement will win the elections, sit down, then automatically only the feminist people will be prioritized in terms of having to try to rush the elections. At least in our model, the 4 years allowance is a reparation for the marginalized. We think that's enough for a transitioning region, and we think that's very much important. But yes.
Actually, the sense of responsibility for political leaders is better if they're elected because you are accountable to everyone indiscreetly and not when you are appointed and are directly accountable to the president, for example.
We don't think that appointment does not automatically mean that you are not accountable for everyone in the first place. Because if you look at it, if you are appointed, then you don't favor any kind of sector. You don't favor the marginalized only. You don't favor the feminist people. You don't favor maybe the Chavacano or the Muslims or the Christians in the first place. Because you know that when you are appointed, you are not representing a specific political party. But with elections, you are more prone to abuses. You are more prone to the marginalized constantly being pushed away because you know that these individuals will still have the same abuses which you are afraid that there is the same problem with ARMM. Let's talk about my first argument. I'm going to talk about the importance of a full-term, the importance of a political full term in terms of in a transitioning region, especially in creating a stronger political atmosphere. Because if you look at it, we have to analyze the psyche of these individuals who are appointed. If you put them in the position and they are aware that their term will only last for 1 year, then you are restricting them in terms of thinking of development project. You are limiting them in terms of the long-term or continuity of the development projects. Maybe they will want to build infrastructures, but they know that it will take so much time, but so maybe they will just try to opt out from those long-term development projects because they're being very limited by their time. So if they want to have educational institutions, for example, they won't want to be able to forward these things because they know that it will be restricted with a one-time period. Sit down. But at least in our model, we don't limit these kinds of development projects. We allow these kinds of, extended kind of allowance to be able to have projects or development projects which are more concentrated on the long-term development because they know that they won't be able to lead these projects. They know that they have to be sensitive with the specific needs of individuals. At least the political parties in our model will have so much time to also be sensitive to the needs of the individuals. So by 2019, when they're already available for elections, they will already be able to become more sensitive and more familiar with the needs of people. But last,
Kurt, you do realize that it's unreasonable for you to expect that we can build up infrastructures perhaps in 1 year. And you do realize that after 4 years, you will still elect people and biases will still exist.
that is exactly the problem. You are implying that once these individuals will be elected into power, there are so little changes that they can do. There are so little things that they can do in that 1 year span period. And really, it's very harmful for the individuals who are appointed, especially when we are sure that these individuals can be able to do their jobs properly. Because if you look at it, the qualifications already tell you that these individuals are fit or capable of being able to address and sensitive to the needs of the individuals, because you don't favor anyone. The second argument, I'm going to talk about the idea of how an immediate election puts the Bangsamoro to become more prone to structural reform. We have to understand that a ministerial form of government, it doesn't follow any schedule in elections. It means that when you have elections by 2016 and you automatically establish the ministerial form of government, at any period of time, as long as the people feel that these people have to be removed from power, they will automatically just remove them from power. So we think that they are not sensitive to time. They are not sensitive to a political term of 4 years or 6 years. So automatically, it is a period of trial and errors. It is a period of political experimentation, because in their model, automatically, the individuals who are automatically elected in power will still have problems in terms of trying to adapt, will still have problems in terms of trying to address the specific or sensitive needs. So automatically, you make them more prone to structural reforms, you make them more prone to people being impeached from power because they are not effective in terms of what they're trying to forward. And we think that a year's worth of appointment will only be centered on building foundations. It means that when you try to have a ministerial form of government, automatically you will be able to build foundations which are very important for people, especially when you talk about the decision in government. We're not against elections, we're not against trying to have voice of the people being heard, but we think it's important to understand and nuance this debate to a transitioning region where we still have to adapt to changes and be sensitive to the specific needs of people. Thank you.
Thank you, BPN. To provide their own extension, let's call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker and members of this House, we don't think that popular support is actually intrinsically bad, even for the Bangsamoro government. Why? Because in the long term, you will need the people to actually learn the value and the value of their individual contribution to that popular support. So that while you need to teach them, for example, in the long term, to elect or to vote wisely, you need to give them now a chance for them to be able to learn how to exercise that kind of political right, so that in the long term, they will have, the experience curve that will make them better voters by, more elections getting conducted. But even if, Mr. Speaker, that there are extents to which that popular support is bad, we ask the government what they could do. Because in our paradigm, we feel that if popular support to some extent can be bad, what we do is to actually teach that political leaders that and the people, that those elected and even appointed political leaders are directly accountable one person or to a group, for example, of panel members, but to everyone who is included in the Bangsamoro political entity. You can only do that if you ensure that at all costs elections will be conducted, that at all costs elections, Mr. Speaker, will be exercised by the people, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. It's only when you have a constant check and balance mechanism through an election that you will be able to teach that people and the political leaders to constantly be accountable and not to just be accountable for, 4 years, for example, or 6 years, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. Yes.
Prove to us that complete or constant accountability is impossible to achieve with individuals who are appointed from power.
We are not saying that it is impossible. What we are saying is that because of the history of the Bangsamoro territory or the regions that it actually acquired, you have a lesser probability that that kind of continuous accountability will always be the case. We believe that if you hold elections, for example, in the future, and have, for example, new people getting elected into the Bangsamoro transition government, then it's only when you've learned and taught the people how to constantly be sensitive as what is the implication in Kurt's second argument, that the full extent or the full accountability for the Bangsamoro government is actually achieved. Other response is this. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that if you allow them to get elected by 2016, the legitimacy of the Bangsamoro transition government does not only come from a mandate or directive of any one individual, but the legitimacy now comes from the people. And it is the true equitable representation that the Bangsamoro people have actually sought for a lot of years or for a lot of decades. We believe, Mr. Speaker, especially when the Bangsamoro people are asking for self-determination, there is therefore that complementary right to actually be able to govern themselves, or if not to govern themselves, but to directly determine who are actually sitting at that certain government. We believe therefore that it's only when you allow them to elect by 2016 that you truly provide that kind of self-identity and that kind of self-determination. We are saying that we do concede that to some extent we may be able to limit the operationality of the Bangsamoro transitionary government. But we think that these things can be mitigated, especially when you have monitoring and compliance commissions, right? But we cannot risk to be able to distort or erode that very essence of self-determination of a self-governing people. That is being able to directly determine the people who will be representing you or the policies which you will want to, for example, be investing upon. We believe furthermore that popular support is actually better because now the policies and the programs that could be implemented in 1 year will be subject to the check and balance system coming from the people. Perhaps all these policies and programs are theoretically effective, but perhaps these things aren't what the people need at the grassroots level, especially when there's a disjunct reality between the government and the people who are experiencing, for example, services, for example, on the day-to-day basis. We need to be able to get a lot of credit from those people so that we determine our priorities at best. And we think that even if biases are inevitable, we believe that elections, using those biases are still better. Why? Because those biases can reflect actually can become a basis actually of what are the prioritizations of any one government, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. But let's go into my positive material. The first is in terms of the MILF as of the long-term political partner for peace and progress. Actually, the AMM is offered actually to the MILF before, but they rejected that offer. They necessarily wanted the Bangsamoro political entity. Why is it so? Because they think that all those political processes and the intricacies inside that system were things that were upholding the injustice that were experienced by the Bangsamoro people. We believe that it is fair if you allow these people to continue not to becoming politically participative, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House, even after a year, it's when you still don't get that same ideal or that same goal. A lot of people still have mistrust or fear the Bangsamoro political people who for a long time, not be able to genuinely exercise their votes, for example, they don't know how to complain, for example, if they don't get basic services, or for example, if their votes, get counted out of the ballot because of the history of dynasties, for example, in that region. We believe at this point in time, especially when the Bangsamoro is a new government that actually tries to empower a lot of people with a lot of prioritizations of rights that weren't afforded before, like freely expressing their religious beliefs, for example, or free democratic political participation. We need to be able to teach them, Mr. Speaker and members of this House, the value of every vote. It's only when you give them a time to see whether basic reasonable expectations, like providing, for example, basic services like healthcare, for example, are already there, that you teach them, for example, the value of every vote, and not to, for example, push them into military, for example, or violent recourse or sentiments. With all respect, we aren't expecting the Bangsamoro government to be 100% perfect. We were expecting that in 1 year they were able to give us basic, reasonable expectations, and we did a check and balance system to see whether those things actually trickle down to the grassroots. It's only when elections happen in 2016 opposition stands. Thanks.
Thank you, DLO. To give us their analysis, let's call on the government whip.
I just want to clarify that the government never said that it is against the elections. What we are here for is to actually extend the appointment of Bangsamoro Transitional Government until 2019. This debate is not about whether appointment is better than elections. This is not about popular support, and this is not about all those things, because as I have mentioned, that this is about whether 1 year is already enough for the appointed Bangsamoro Transitional Government during its run. Because the clear issue in this debate whether there is already a level of preparedness in terms of, for example, political functions and all the in terms of accomplishing all its duties and responsibilities as a form of government. We don't think, Mr. Chair, the members of this House, that the government, the level of preparedness of the transitional government is enough. Why? Because we don't think that the Bangsamoro Transitional Government, with its limited time, will be able to fully accomplish all the necessary responsibilities, all the necessary works, or for example, developmental projects, commitments, and other functionalities that are embraced therein. For example, in the functionality of the Bangsamoro government. Now, coming from the leader of the opposition, the fact that they conceded that 1 year is immature actually gives us the upper hand in this debate, because that is what we are fighting for in this debate. We actually say that 1 year is not enough. It's actually immature because when the government is still in the process of transitioning, and we believe so, that 1 year, that a particular amount of time is not enough to prepare for the actual thing, which is the elections in 2016. If that's the case, and also they talked about that we cannot test the real essence of Bangsamoro if the people will have to wait for 2019. They also talked about that we need to correct mistakes early on. That's why we don't need to extend the appointment of Bangsamoro Transitional Government until 2019. Mr. Chair, we have to look at the nature of transitional government. It serves as a pilot testing for the actual government that will actually take place in 2019. If there are any moments to actually reverse the possibility of errors, or to make trials and experimentation or trial and errors, it's
in this particular time in the transitional government because it serves as a pilot testing to the actual government that will happen in 2019. And why is time value so important? Because we believe, Mr. Chair, that we want to emphasize that it actually gives us a guarantee to, as what the government is trying to say, it actually gives us a guarantee to transitional stability, since the government will be able to create to plan long-term developmental projects and not short-term projects or commitments that will have short-term benefits. And why does this thing really important? It's because, Mr. Chair, we believe that if we have enough preparation, for example, in this particular debate, if we have enough prep time to prepare, for example, for 10 minutes compared to that of 5 minutes, then there will be a drastic change in terms of the preparation of our manner and method. Because much the same way as that, Mr. Chair, if we have enough preparation, if we are ready, if we are able to actually fulfill all our necessary functions, if we are able to run a full length of our term of service, for example, if you try to take a look at the President's term is actually 6 years, Vice President's term is actually also 6 years, and as well as the Senator, Mayor 3 years, and the Congressman 3 years. Just imagine how will the government actually be able to serve. Yes.
An individual's vote reflects the day-to-day interactions of that individual with the government. Why are you so afraid to hear out that valid opinion coming from those individuals?
We never said that we are not going to have elections. Yes, we are going to have elections, but what we are trying to prevent here is to have actually errors or mistakes, because as we have been saying all along that this is a pilot testing, a trial and error, this is a transition, so that before the actual thing happens, which is the elections for the year 2019, errors will be prevented, or there will be enough preparation, for example, in terms of the structural reforms, in terms of for example, amendments and things like that, and for example, job specifications. Yes, and as we have been pointing, Mr. Chair and the members of this most of this House, that time value is really important. And coming from the Deputy Leader of Opposition, the Deputy Leader of Opposition talked about self-determination or the right to self-rule of the Bangsamoro. Well, we tell you that, yes, we are not against elections, but we are trying to point out that marginalized people will not necessarily be recognized. Because, for example, if you're going to have elections early on, then not necessarily the voices of the marginalized people will be heard. That's why we need to actually cater to our needs first before we transition to the actual elections that will happen in 2019. And Mr. Chair, if you try to look at it, as I have been mentioning a while ago, we also pointed out that there is stability in terms of the transition when we are going to extend the appointment of Bangsamoro Transitional Government, that there will be, we also pointed out that, because of that, we believe that the government takes the lead in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip. To react to the preceding speaker, let's call on the Opposition Whip.
I don't understand, Mr. Chair, why the government is so afraid to change those appointees that the President appointed, Mr. Chair. The kind of fear that they have right now is just maybe because there can be a priority change if we change those appointees. But the point is, those appointees operate on the basis of the framework agreement. It doesn't necessarily mean that we try to change those appointees. It will necessarily have change in priority, Mr. Chair. Remember, whether you're an appointee or an electee at that, it doesn't change the fact that what you're trying to work for and what you're trying to achieve is in accordance with the framework agreement. Meaning, it doesn't necessarily give you an assurance or a guarantee that when we try to elect, the kind of leaders that we will have are those leaders that are necessarily different, with different ideologies and aspirations from those that were appointed by the President, Mr. Chair. For that very reason, I don't see how the case of the government actually flies in this debate. Also, Mr. Chair, I don't see how priority change can also actually happen on the ground, particularly because there will be a pressure coming from the individual or the constituents themselves, Mr. Chair. It enters the picture primarily because there's a shift of responsibility that will happen now in this way. I would like to talk about two issues. Number one, on where do we best answer the difference or distinguishing factor between ARMM and Bangsamoro government. In short, how do we tell the people, how do we inspire them that the government we have now is not the government that you had yesterday, and the government we have now is a government that prioritizes your needs. And secondly, where do we allow the formation of a long-term partnership that's actually grounded on peace and progress, which actually enshrined in our democratic government? Number one, where do we best answer the difference between ARMM and Bangsamoro government? We admit, Mr. Chair, that that 1 year is not enough, perhaps, to finish an infrastructure. But it's highly, very unreasonable for you to expect us to go beyond delivering basic rights, Mr. Chair. What we expect to deliver by 1 year are just basic services, perhaps. Services on healthcare, services on education. We don't need to hurry up by perhaps having taxation systems ready by 1 year, Mr. Chair. What is important is we try to analyze the psychology of the people on the ground. They're not aware how taxation works. They're not aware how actually intricate governmental proceedings work. What people are aware of is whether or not the government is able to give their needs, whether or not the government can give them the basic services which weren't present when ARMM was still the government. Meaning, when we allow for 1 year, the reasonable expectation is that we are able to deliver all the basic necessities or the basic needs, Mr. Chair. For example, perhaps we can allow a woman who wanted to deliver in a health center now actually deliver in a health center, which weren't actually available or feasible during ARMM because they don't have any nurses, perhaps. They only have midwives, Mr. Chair. Meaning, we don't expect to have complete infrastructures, Mr. Chair. We don't actually expect all local government units to actually be present. But what we expect is that we can deliver basic services to the people. And when we analyze the psychology of the people, it tells you that that kind of delivery of services is what is important. That kind of delivery of basic services is what tells the people that we are different from ARMM. It's the kind of delivery of services that will tell people that right now you're already being empowered, Mr. Chair. It's the kind of political atmosphere that we actually want to establish on the ground. And my previous speaker actually told you how valid elections are, particularly because the votes casted are actually the reflection of an individual's day-to-day interaction with the government, Mr. Chair. I understand that the other side is not against election, but what I don't understand is that what are their standards for actually skipping elections, Mr. Chair? Is it just okay for them to tell me because you want the marginalized to be represented? Is it actually a valid ground to actually skip elections on 2016? Is it actually valid for them to tell us, or maybe by 2016, those marginalized people will not still be represented on the ground? That's why we won't have any elections, Mr. Chair. I don't think that's valid. I think it's okay to skip elections as long as we have standards, Mr. Chair. Particularly, perhaps we don't have the proper machineries, or perhaps the votes cast are questionable. But that's not the case coming from the government. That's why I don't see why skipping election is actually valid on the ground. And what is actually happening when you try to keep those people who are appointed is that you're trying to nurture the mistrust that has been built up over years of political non-representation, of disempowerment during the time of ARMM. And I actually don't see where marginalization is actually solved on the ground just because you kept those people who are appointed. Remember, priorities do not change even if you elect new leaders. Meaning, marginalization, even if it will still remain a problem in 1 year, there is an assurance that when we elect, the same problem of marginalization will still be answered on the ground, Mr. Chair. And even if, let's say, 1 year is a limited working space, we still say it's still a working space, Mr. Chair. And it's unreasonable for you to expect that we can achieve everything in just 1 year, Mr. Chair. While on the other hand, if you have election, there's a transfer of legitimacy from the government to the people, Mr. Chair. And we're actually trying to check whether the Bangsamoro government is doing the fundamental things right, Mr. Chair. Secondly, where do we allow the formation of a long-term partnership that's grounded in peace and progress, Mr. Chair? Is the government even aware that MILF is backing Bangsamoro government primarily because they want to shed their identity as a military force, Mr. Chair? They want to achieve that by 2016, they no longer seen as a military entity, but now as a political entity that cares and prioritizes the needs of the people, Mr. Chair. Is the government even aware that when we have an election, it's a form of empowering the people. It's a form of reminding them that you have this right. Even if you weren't able to practice this during ARMM times, right now, we're allowing you to practice this. Right now, we're allowing you to feel the right to vote, and we're allowing you the right to decide for your own decision. What we want to achieve is a long-term partnership, Mr. Chair. You want to meet what MILF wants to meet, and you want to give what the people on the ground needs, Mr. Chair. In other words, the kind of partnership that we will have is a partnership that is strengthened by the MILF, the people, and the government of the Philippines, Mr. Chair. Not just a relationship that is there because you want to, that is there just because the government has a responsibility because it appointed the people, Mr. Chair. It's a responsibility that the government will have to fulfill in this debate.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. To give us the last speech of the opposition, let's call on one of their speakers.
Hello. What should happen in 1 year? That is the basic question in this debate. Opposition wasn't asking for the Bangsamoro government to be perfect in 1 year. But coming from the lens of the people will expect in 1 year basic reasonable expectations. Like for example, being able to be given, for example, health services or certain rights to education, Mr. Speaker and members of this House. It's not so much for the people to be able to ask these kinds of basic rights. Therefore, in a span of 1 year, the people will now be able to see whether the theoretical policies and programs enshrined by the government in the Bangsamoro territory are getting realized on the grassroots level, or are those policies and programs the things that the Bangsamoro government should be able to prioritize at that point in time. In 1 year, we are making the fundamental policies and programs that could run for medium term or long term. And if we do not have a proper check and balance mechanism that is so powerful, like coming from the people, Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't be able to effectively correct those kinds of fundamental flaws that would affect us in the medium term and the long term. That's the contribution of leader of opposition. But what about the government? They said that in 1 year, we will not, if you vote in 2016, you will limit the operationality or the working space of the Bangsamoro transition government. It's not the votes that actually limited the working space. It's the time and the level of burden. Therefore, it's not about whether you in the 2016, your votes limiting the capacity of these individuals, but the burden themselves. Whether or not we elect them, we choose to elect them by 2016, the burden is still there. But what they can do as a basic burden is to give the people the basic services that they could give, or for example, gain the trust of their people in 1 year and ensure that they're able to get as much political support as possible. In 1 year, you can do that. We aren't expecting you to be perfect. vote or to be able to exercise a political participation that is long overdue to them. After that 1 year, you will be able to have the identity of the Bangsamoro that is enshrined in their framework, for example, or in any peace agreement that will tell them that the Bangsamoro is different from its previous regimes. So the Bangsamoro is politically empowering individuals. It's only when you allow them to constantly check upon and ask for accountability coming from the lens of the people that you really enshrine that essence of the Bangsamoro government or that kind of ideal. Mr. Speaker and members of this House, the government has a noble cause, that is to really operationalize the Bangsamoro government. But whether or not we hold elections in 2016, there is still that big burden. What could we do then, coming from the lens of the state or for the people, is to instill to institutionalize as early on a correcting mechanism for any fundamental flaws that could happen. No standards were given by the government as to when you can be able to skip a certain election. We believe that even if you only have a 1-year experience, in terms of getting to know a certain government, you still have a valid opinion on how that government should be able to operate in the medium term and the long term. Therefore, you need to be empowered to have a vote in the 2016 election. We believe that the motion should fall. Thank you.
To give the last speech of the round, let's call on the government.
If you analyze the case of opposition, I'm also confused. Because coming from BLO, she said that if there are appointees, then you are eroding the legitimacy of the Bangsamoro. That if you have appointees, then automatically you don't have constant accountability. But coming from opposition whip, he said that if you have appointees, it's okay because their framework is still centered on the Bangsamoro. So if you look at it, all the harms of BLO was automatically neutralized by opposition whip when he said that there is nothing wrong with appointees. It's just that you just have to fulfill your basic reasonable expectation or your basic burden. There was an overall automatic concession from opposition that they know that 1 year is a premature time period. So automatically, all the harms that he presented coming from government were very clear and still standing. When he told you that there is a limited kind of development programs, that there is no continuity in terms of the projects that we are presenting. But if you look at it, let's try to analyze the entire case of opposition side. They said that they have a value in terms of popular support, that they want to teach the people the value of voting, and it is always reflective of their day-to-day experiences. Number one, teaching them cannot really happen in a span of 1 year because their observations will be very limited to new beginnings. Their observations will be very limited to, trying to adapt to changes. So obviously, all these kinds of, observations are not really necessary in terms of trying to teach them of what the value of a vote is. At least, in our model, when we extend the elections to 2019, the day-to-day experiences will still be reflected, but at least the value of the vote is even more important because the people now are all the more aware of the lapses, for example, of the appointees, assuming there are, so we don't think that these kinds of problems that they presented really are happening. But they said that the legitimacy of the Bangsamoro comes from the people and not just from the amendment. Obviously, if you have appointees, the legitimacy still stands. They never really proved why if you have appointees, automatically there's no legitimacy from the people. We don't think that having appointees will automatically assume that these individuals will never work for the people. And they also said that constant accountability is not impossible, but it's also not guaranteed. But if you look at it, the MILF are the ones who will appoint the people in the position. So obviously, the priority of the MILF are also the people who are part of the Bangsamoro. So we think that this constant accountability is guaranteed in our model because at least the people's prioritization will always be centered on the people. And we also told you that when you are appointed, your accountability isn't prioritized on the political party who voted for you. But lastly, they also question that there are no standards presented in our model for skipping the elections. Number one, we told you that the standard is we are in a transitioning period. We are adapting to certain changes. And when you are transitioning, you are still vulnerable to trial and errors. You are still vulnerable to certain kinds of adaptations. So we think that this kind of vulnerability is an enough standard for us to skip elections, especially when they did not respond on the idea that these kinds of individuals will still have those historical lapses. But if you look at it, we also have another standard. the historical narratives of the ARMM is that they are vulnerable to electoral lapses. So if you look at it, if you automatically rush to elections, the same vulnerability will still apply, especially when these individuals are not able to have enough time period to actually, actualize. But in our model, after 4 years, we are no longer vulnerable to these kinds of, electoral lapses. Because at least these individuals are already able to study the effectivity of our projects. Because if you look at it, they also question that these kinds of projects might be theoretically effective, but it's not what the people need. At worst, maybe these kinds of projects really are just theoretically effective, but you cannot deny the value of these kinds of projects in terms of still being able to operate. But on best case scenario, you have to value these kinds of, operational kinds of projects, because at least these kinds of things will at least be able to guarantee the goal of having a more peaceful Mindanao and Bangsamoro framework. We are incredibly proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, speakers. You may now cross the House.